Alright guys, hope everyone's well and welcome back to the Improvement Podcast. So in this episode I'm going to touch on peri-workout considerations. And for those that don't know, peri-workout is simply the period around your training. So it would be classed as your intra workout, so what you're having during your session, and your post workout, or what you're having after your session. And this is what I'd say the most important time to kind of be on the ball with your nutrition, the most important time to kind of make sure your boxes are ticked and your variables are nailed if you are wanting to improve your physique, if you're wanting to build muscle, if you're wanting to lose body fat as well, because having more muscle will generally make it easier to lose body fat as a byproduct of having more muscle. So it basically will allow you to perform the best you can if you can get these nailed, allow better recovery, and allow better partitioning of nutrients. And what I mean by that is it's obviously what creates a deficit or a surplus, meaning what makes us lose weight or gain weight, is calories in, calories out. However, something to consider is like the timing of those calories. It's like, I do believe, let's say you had all your calories as far away from training as possible, or had your calories as close to training as you can. I believe the end product, if you do that throughout a whole gaining phase, is going to be far different. Or maybe not, it will be different. There will definitely be differences in my opinion. So it will basically allow you to make the most of the food you're consuming, build muscle more effectively, and just have a better body composition as a whole. So like I said, it's split up to 3 different categories. I'm going to touch on pre-workout first and some considerations around that. So when it comes to a pre-training meal, when we think about the role of it, it's simply to make sure that we are fueled for training. We are fueled to have a productive session and to perform well. So in order to do so, we want to first of all be hydrated. That's kind of a given, and that's something we should kind of always ensure we're doing. But you want to make sure your hydration's in a good spot. So in terms of hydration, that's made up of basically having appropriate amounts of water and having an appropriate amount of electrolytes, which can be consumed through salt, as salt contains things like sodium, potassium, which are kind of like the main electrolytes we're wanting. So first of all, make sure you are drinking enough so that you're not going into the session with your urine like the colour of Coke. You want it relatively clear or you want it clear or close to it. And the reason being is that will be like a good marker to ensure we're reasonably hydrated. As for salt, I recommend, if you've not really paid attention to it, and if you're an active individual and this is obviously a different recommendation to someone who's sedentary and has high blood pressure, but for the most part, if you're an active individual, you're sweating a lot, having salt in your diet will only do you good, in my opinion. And this is something I see a lot of people think salt's bad for you, but I disagree. It's like we need sodium for muscular contractions. It can actually help in terms of manage your blood pressure more effectively. You can have low blood pressure if you have a lack of salt as well. And what you'll find is if you have appropriate amount of salt, you'll probably get a better pump and you'll be able to utilise carbohydrates effectively. You'll be able to have more energy throughout the day and throughout your training. And why we want salt is because when we basically have fluids, especially when we increase our fluids when it's warm, we basically wash out the salt in our body, the sodium and potassium. We will excrete that through sweat, through urine as well. So we want to make sure we're replacing that accordingly. So now that hydration's out the way, what we want to consider is, when it comes to like having a meal, we want to consider how much carbs we're having, protein and some fat. And we want to understand the role of each to know how much of each we should have. So in terms of protein, that the role of protein is basically to spike muscle protein synthesis, to put us in a positive state to build muscle and to recover. And when it comes to fat plays a part in our hormonal health. It also slows down the digestion of carbohydrates, which is our main consideration around the session. And carbohydrates are our main source of energy, and they're we want to make sure what we're having before our session is relatively easy to digest. So we don't want to be having something that sits in our stomach and feels like we take absolutely ages to digest. We want something that sits relatively well, doesn't bag you up too much, and doesn't give you any digestive distress during your session. So make sure you're picking quality food choices for you that sit well. And when it comes to like your pre-workout meal, a consideration is like how long before the gym are you actually having it. What I mean is, if you're having, let's say, your meal 10 minutes before stepping in the gym, that's going to look different than someone who eats 2 hours before stepping in the gym. So maybe the guidelines I'd give those two individuals are going to be drastically different. For the most part, the closer you're having your meal to your session, the smaller it will be, just so you're not going into the gym with food that's not being digested and just sits in your gut. Reason we don't want that is when we aren't kind of utilising the food, or if we aren't digesting the food. If you're going to the session and we've got a lot of food in our stomach undigested, then that will basically pull blood to the gut, because we need to pull blood to the gut to carry out digestive processes. So if we're pulling blood to the gut, where is the blood not? The blood's not in our muscles. And what's that going to affect? Our potential impact, or it's going to have a potential impact on our ability to perform, progress our lifts, and get things like a pump, which can help in terms of recovery potentially. And in terms of like roughly what I'd say is how much of each to have is you want like at least 25 grams of protein. As for carbohydrates, again, it depends how far away you're training. If, let's say, you're training like an hour or an hour and a half after your meal, you are starting your training, then having around like 70 to 90 grams of carbs could be a good spot for, like I said, energy purposes, with 10 to 15 grams of fat just to slow those digestion of the carbohydrates we're consuming. Again, that's just rough, like a rough guide. See, if you're stepping foot in the gym in 10 minutes, then a banana and a protein shake could be a better option for yourself. Or if you're training 3 hours before, or if, let's say, you're training fasted, then what you want to do is have a big meal the night before. So we want to consider, the main thing is how close to training we're having that meal. But this is primarily where we want to have the most carbs when we're dieting and in a surplus, so that we can retain our performance when we're dieting, maybe still progress as well, which we definitely can. And also when we're in a surplus, it just means we're going to have the majority of our food, we're going to utilise it, which kind of makes sense on paper. It's like, it doesn't make sense having food where we're not going to benefit from it. Like, let's say you had it the opposite, you had it as far away from your training as possible, then you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. You're not giving yourself the carbohydrates where you need them, where you're going to use them for performance, if that makes sense. And the reason we want carbohydrates in our system is because when blood sugar levels are lower, basically from having not a lot of carbs in us at that time, if we're burning through them or just not ate, then our performance can drop, which we obviously don't want. And also, like I said, salt your meal, make sure you're hydrated going into it. And what matters as well is like what point in a gaining phase or diet you're at. And what I mean by that is, see if you are deep in a gaining phase. Like, I've been gaining for 9 months now. If I have like a really small meal pre-workout, it's probably not going to affect me as much as if I was, let's say, dieting and didn't have a lot of carbs at all, and I just didn't have that meal, for example, or had maybe less than I probably should have, if that makes sense. So that's also what matters, because at the end of the day, like, if I'm eating 4.5 thousand calories, I'll probably have calories from other meals. I'm not just going to digest through them rapid, because that's not how it works. Food takes a long time to digest, so that is something else to consider. Next up, I'm going to talk about intra workout. So intra workout is basically consuming nutrients or macronutrients during your session in order to perform well and to help you recover. So what I have during my session, and I recommend having as well, if you are ticking all your boxes, meaning if you are training consistently, training hard, nailing your nutrition elsewhere, nailing your hydration elsewhere, then this is something to consider. Again, don't consider this if you've not ticked the other boxes, as you're just kind of wasting your money, if that makes sense. What's going to matter most is, again, hitting your calorie goal, hitting your protein goal, sleeping well, and doing all those basics. But once they're covered, this can be something super valuable. So what I have in workout is basically carbohydrates, electrolytes, and also essential amino acids. And I'll get into what the benefit of each is. So first of all, I have carbohydrates intra-workout through highly branched cyclic dextrin. And highly branched cyclic dextrin is just a carbohydrate powder with a high osmolarity rate. And what that basically means is, if it's got a high osmolarity rate, it basically means you can break it down fast, so you digest it fast. It doesn't require much water to be pulled into the gut. It doesn't require much digestion to be carried out, which means we won't pull our blood into our stomach, which is going to be counterproductive to performing, and you'll feel bloated. You might get some digestive distress. So highly branched cyclic dextrin is a really good carbohydrate powder that digests well, whereas some others like dextrose, maltodextrin, things like that don't as such to an extent. And the benefit of having carbs is that it basically prevents muscle protein breakdown, and the reason being is, I won't dive into the science behind it too much, but carbohydrates spike insulin. When we're producing insulin, we're in an anti-catabolic state. We're in a good state to kind of not break down muscle. So that kind of gives us a steady release of carbohydrates. One, because we're sipping on it during a session. Two, because highly branched cyclic dextrin, that specific carbohydrate powder, gets released nice and gradual. It's got like a slow release rate, although it digests super well and easy and doesn't pull blood into the stomach. And yeah, that puts us into like an anti-catabolic state so that we don't have as much soreness after the session, because muscle, like when we have muscle damage, that's from muscle protein breakdown. So if we can prevent that, it means we can potentially speed up that recovery process. So we're not spending as much time recovering from muscle damage and more time growing muscle after our training. And we can maybe train more frequently, we can maybe train harder and recover from more. And also you have essential amino acids, which is something else I consume. And that just basically gives you an additional muscle protein synthesis spike. So when we're eating protein, that spikes muscle protein synthesis, put us in a good position to build muscle, recover, and pretty much whenever you do this, granted your meals are spaced out adequately, you spike muscle protein synthesis again, which allows you to again just give you another opportunity to have protein which can promote muscle growth and put you in a good position to start building muscle tissue, if that makes sense. And you don't want to eat actual food during your training. The reason why we don't want to eat food during our training, we don't want to snack on things like Haribo's or whatever, or eat a banana or whap out some chicken and rice mid-session, is because it pulls blood into the stomach, which won't really be digested in our session, because when we're training, we're in a fight or flight state. We're in a state where we're not digesting food well because we're training hard. Your body's not prioritizing digesting some chicken and rice because you're focusing on training hard. Your body's in fight or flight mode. So in that case, you don't want to be eating during your session, and that's why everything I'm saying, like essential amino acids, carbohydrates, they're already like digested. That's why I'm not telling you to have a chicken breast during your session. And EAs are basically the building blocks of protein, so it means it's already kind of like broken down and digested, and it's really easy to absorb and utilize. And of course, next up is electrolytes. So you can have electrolyte powder or salt, both are valuable, and like I touched on earlier, can help you get a pump, can help in terms of utilizing carbohydrates more effectively. And it's good to generally have like electrolytes or salt if you're consuming a lot of water, which I do during my session. And if you are having something flavoured during your session, putting salt in it doesn't taste too horrible, which is good. And in terms of post-workout, so what you eat after your session, if your pre and intra workout is nailed, this is a wee bit less of a priority. What I mean by that is, if you've had a great pre-workout meal, you've had intra workout carbohydrates, maybe essential amino acids with some salt or a hydration formula, you don't need to sprint to your car and eat as soon as possible. The reason being is you're ahead of the ball. You've already had your intra workout, which kind of delays the need for having something right after your session. However, it is still a very good time to get a lot of carbohydrates in as well as protein, especially if you have had a long session. So basically, the reason why we want to have carbohydrates after a session is it basically replenishes our glycogen stores, puts you in an anti-catabolic state, like I said, and also we can utilise and uptake them very well, basically use them more effectively than we can in other points of the day. And the reason being is GLUT4, which is basically a carrier protein, so basically this thing in your body is upregulated and it gets sent to a muscle. So long story short, without complicating things, after training, we're in a really good position to soak up all the carbs, use all the carbs, store them as glycogen, meaning store them in our muscles, and not put them on his body fat or not gain body fat. So it makes sense having a lot there, which maybe over the long term will mean we might have a better body composition in terms of holding more muscle, holding less body fat. So it's a really good time to do so, because that's where we're ultimately using carbohydrates most. That's where we've got the demand for carbohydrates. So it makes sense to have them around the training window. And in terms of having protein, so again, it's generally good to have protein servings spaced out. And this will basically spike muscle protein synthesis, so start the muscle kind of like repair process. When we have muscle damage, when we're, let's say, sore, we've got DOMS, which is delayed onset muscle soreness. We have protein that helps you kind of recover from that delayed onset muscle soreness. And we don't ideally want fat in this meal, in my opinion. Maybe slight amounts, but in my opinion, it kind of makes sense to not have a lot so you can quickly replenish your glycogen stores and quickly uptake those nutrients that you're consuming. That is, yes, folk joke about the anabolic window, which is basically like you need to eat immediately after your session. You need to get a protein shake down you rapid, and you don't need to right away, but still it is, from the reasons discussed, quite a good time to have some food. Usually people's appetite's nice and high after a session as well, and it's easy to, let's say, fit another meal in if you eat quite soon after your session instead of maybe waiting an hour and a bit. You're kind of missing an opportunity to eat. And in terms of like how much carbs to eat, so in something close to what I said pre-workout, so it could be 70, it could be anything up to 110 grams of carbs. Basically, how much can you eat without any digestive distress while adhering to your diet as a whole? That's kind of what matters most when it comes to it. And something that I typically consume post-workout could be like cream of rice and whey protein, or it could be cereal and whey, or it could just be chicken and rice, or it could be bagels, jam and a protein shake, just something with a lot of carbohydrates in it and not a ton of fat. And like I said, these guidelines aren't set in stone. So if, let's say, you are pre-workout training quite close to your session, then you don't need as much fat. If, let's say, you're training super far away from your last meal, from the meal you've consumed prior, you want more fat and you want a bit of a bigger meal as a whole. And also, like, things like fibre will influence it as well. Fibre slows the digestion of carbohydrates, so if you've got like a high fibrous source pre-workout, then that's also going to influence things, so that's something to consider. But hope you've enjoyed the episode. If you have any questions, feel free to just drop me a message on Instagram, and I'll happily answer them regarding anything pre, intra and post-workout, or in other words, anything in that peri-workout window. And if you did enjoy the episode, feel free to tag me, share it on your story if you did. Also, like, subscribe, leave a comment, rating or review, that sort of thing. So yeah, greatly appreciate everyone listening. Hope you've enjoyed the episodes.